And you're never going to get to where you need to be unless that strategy is well defined, it's executable for a start, so it's doable, and that it's well communicated so people understand what their role is in delivering it.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and in each of these episodes, I get the privilege of sitting down with various business process management practitioners, whether they're working internally at an organization or whether they're coming in from that sort of consulting perspective. But I think the really important thing or the valuable thing about these conversations is I'm sitting down with people that are putting business process management into practice each and every day. We're not talking about theory here. We're talking about what organizations need to be aware of, what they need to be thinking of when they're managing their processes, when they're understanding their processes, because, ultimately every value that an organization creates and delivers comes through a process. And this morning or today, I had the absolute privilege of sitting down with Jackie O'Dowd. Now, Jackie is the founding partner and chief executive officer at Realizing Potential. Jackie focuses on optimization and transformation and has worked in a number of organizations of various sizes from that consulting perspective. But I'm interested and excited to learn more about your history and experience, Jackie. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Daniel. It's great to be here.
So what we might do to begin with is I'll hand it off to you that was obviously a very brief introduction. If you can take us back to when, I guess, process management first piqued your interest, and then take us on a journey leading up to the work that you're doing today.
Okay. Well, it's got a long history. I've been doing this now for a very long time. It started for me, I think, in the early 80s when business processes piqued my interest. I was the IT services manager at that point for a large multinational manufacturer. They did furniture and industrial foams and healthcare equipment. So it was a really diverse sort of business. And so one of my roles was to make sure that the technology and systems that were put throughout those factories and businesses actually enabled the business to be more competitive, get the right costs, be more efficient, effective.
Right.
So in order to do that, you really had to have a good understanding of how things happened. What was the business's way of being and doing? So that was the first thing that piqued my interest. The second part in that particular experience was what constituted better or best practice, because each of those factories were aiming for both of those things. So not just efficiency and effectiveness, but they actually wanted to be a leader in their segment, which was a big thing in the 1980s.
Right.
So that's when I first started and piqued my interest. And then that interest grew after I left that organization, and I actually went to work for an IBM and Microsoft partner that used to sell and implement ERP applications and CRM applications.
Right.
And again, that's all process-based. So the learnings from the manufacturing environments and the financial environments that I'd had actually just all morphed into that, but it started to sort of spread across different industries like manufacturing, services, healthcare, petroleum. So each industry has set nuances to their processes and needs different outcomes. So over time, it's grown. And then in 2002, one of my great learnings out of all of that was people would buy systems and put them in and actually not know what they'd bought. And they were really not prepared to make the level of change that was needed to implement the systems. They didn't understand their processes.
Right.
They didn't know what a future state could look like. They just bought a bright, shiny object in an ERP system or a CRM system and hoped to God it was all going to work. So I started Realizing Potential in 2002 to overcome that problem, to help clients actually realize their own potential by getting 7 key things right. And without those 7 things, please don't waste money on putting new systems in.
Yes, right.
So, and we are where we are today. And as part of all of that, one of the requests from one large mining services client that we did some work for was well, it's great while you're here, but what happens when you leave and you're not with us, because you don't want to come and live with us?
Yes.
So we actually put all of the knowledge and intellectual property we garnered over the last 10 years into a BPM platform with an IP library sitting on top of it. So we called it the Realizing Success platform. So it's a BPM platform at its core, but it has a whole heap of step-by-step guides, checklists, all the things that prevent organizations from falling for the pitfalls.
Yes, right. That's
So
great.
that's, in a nutshell, that's where I've come from and why I think BPM is so important, because it's at the core of everything that a business does. Yes.
And I think probably the burning question on everyone's minds right now is those 7 key things that you mentioned just before for an organization to realize their potential. Yeah. Talk to us about what that is and how does business process management fit into that?
Okay, well, it's got a very key part and it's a core part of the 7. But the first one is the strategy. So what is the organization trying to achieve? What objectives and goals does it have? Because without that, there's no anchor point for any of those processes.
Right.
And you're never going to get to where you need to be unless that strategy is well defined, it's executable for a start, so it's doable, and that it's well communicated so people understand what their role is in delivering it. So that's the first one. Second one are the organizational structures, because they always get in the way. When a company forms, then it's a legal entity, and then it starts building out people, processes, all of those things. But then they evolve over time and they don't get reshaped very often unless there's a merger or an acquisition. So strategy and structures are key. Then there's the processes. What are we doing and how are we doing it? Then there's the people component, because that's the skills and capability and brain power that brings this all together. Then there's the technology, the great enabler, whatever that technology is. It can be as small as MyOb, it can be as complex as SAP, an ERP system. And then there's data and information. It's the lifeblood now, and it's one of the biggest assets a company has, even though it's not on the balance sheet. It is a big asset. And then the final piece in that jigsaw puzzle is governance. How do you bring the opportunity and risk and compliance standards together to envelop those 6 other things to make sure the business stays on the right track?
Yes, that's great.
So we call it the alignment model. And it's just bringing those 7 things together. And I think if you get those right, when a business gets those right, the results can be just amazing.
Yes, right. And when an organization, I guess, embarks on their BPM journey, or understanding, well, what are our processes? How do we deliver value? Is it aligned to our strategy? Do we have governance over it? Things like that. What is one of the biggest challenges you find that organizations face when embarking on that journey?
I think there's 2 big challenges. One is armor, and the other are anchors.
Okay.
So the armor is, we've tried this before and it doesn't work, so they become really defensive.
Right.
And then the anchors are, we've always done it this way. This is our way, whether it's, an approach or part of their culture, whatever it is. They're the 2 biggest things. I think the other challenge is that every business now has got hundreds of initiatives underway, whether they're formal projects or hidden projects, whatever they are. There's lots of stuff going on in an organization. So trying to get BPM in isolation as a priority is a challenge.
Yes, right.
Because everybody says the general thing when I start talking to organizations is, we've tried it, it cost us a lot of time, it cost us a lot of money, didn't get the outcome that we needed. My response to that, well, that's the way you've done it.
Yes.
You've done it one way, there's a different way. And you need to get it right if you're going to have a sustainable, resilient business that's highly effective.
Yes. Yes.
So I think they're really the key challenges that I see.
And are they generally coming from that executive level, as opposed to, obviously you need to get that sponsorship from the executive level, but there's also working with the process practitioners or the frontline employees that I'd assume that there could be an objection or challenge there when you come in and they say, well, we've always done this for the last 5, 10, 15 years. This is the way we've done it. Why do we need to change things? It's working fine. So is it objections from both of those perspectives, or do you find it's more one over the other?
No, look, the executives got to give us the buy-in and the sponsorship because they're the ones that are paying the bills at the end of the day. But the practitioners have a different set of problems, I think.
Right.
And a lot of those depends on the methods or approaches that they're using. Are they doing it to a BPMN standard, or are they not? If it's not, it's a free-for-all. If they are, then you've got something that you can potentially build on and take forward. So that's the first one. Second are the modelling tools that they use. Quite often we'll go into an organisation and there's 6 or 7 different tools being used. So the business doesn't get the value of having a shared information platform.
Right.
So some people can be using Visio, some can be using ProMap, some can be using Business Optics. There can be a whole heap of tools out there. And if it's a large organization, every function has its own. So bringing that together and getting a level of standardization, I think, is really critical. It's one of the big challenges. It's getting everything in one space.
Yes.
And getting that information out. Because you don't model for modeling's sake. We're doing it to effect a change. And the great thing is when models are done properly, and properly is my subjective term, the amount of business intelligence that you pull out of those models is amazing. An average model, if it's done to a good standard and to an appropriate level of detail, it can give you something like 250 bits of process intelligence,
right,
that can help shape the model and adds value to the business.
Yes, right.
So yeah, there are challenges at every level. And then from the stakeholder level, it's making sure that you're doing things with people, that, the guys that are responsible for the change, for the modeling, the design and the change, actually work with people and involve them and not do things to people.
Right.
Because the change doesn't stick. And that's when the defense mechanisms go up.
Yes. Okay. And I guess they would be in the best position to identify the pain points and the problems and I guess the areas of opportunity.
No one knows how to fix a problem better than the person actually doing the job. That's been my experience. People in different areas may think they have a view and they'd like to have some input into how it's shaped, but it's been my experience, especially in engineering firms, mining services organizations, it's the people actually doing the job who are the experts.
Yes.
People actually necessarily doing the models are not. So it's really important to listen and learn.
Yes, right. And for, let's just say there's someone listening to this right now, or there will be someone listening to this, that they're in an organization where maybe they haven't adopted BPM or to the level that it could be adopted. I know some organizations out there where it's an organization of a couple of thousand people and there's one person in the entire organization that's been given the role process design lead or something like that for the entire organization. And so that this person, they're trying to get adoption. They're trying to get the organization to adopt business process management. It's a huge task, to change that culture but it's got to start with the top and talking to that executive level. How do you go about getting buy-in from that executive level? Because you did mention there a number of different challenges and I guess objections to BPM. How should someone go about whether, I guess for someone that is internal, how do they go about, I guess, speaking the language of the executive team so that they see the value in BPM, and how do they handle those objections?
I think it's all about communication.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the first thing.
Mm.
It's all about the problem that you're trying to solve. Mm-hmm. BPM on its own is an approach and a tool. You know, it's a way of doing things.
Yes.
But yet, collectively, the organization's trying to solve a particular problem. So start with something small.
Right.
Then model that out so it communicates the problem and how that problem can be overcome. So if you've got two states, current state, potential future state, or multiple states if there's a scenario situation, but in its simplest form, current state, future state. What are the changes? What do we find? What systems are involved? What roles are involved? What customers are involved if a process is tailored towards a specific deliverable or customer? So I think for me, it's all about visualizing what the problem is and then communicating that out and showing how quickly that BPM approach, that current future state design approach, can solve that problem.
Yes, right.
We did a project last year with a large health organization, and they were using Visio and Orbis Server as their tool. But when we started looking at them, they were looking at a huge business transformation. You know, they'd bitten off a huge project. They were undertaking a huge project. They had something like 300 models along the passageway floor, and people were walking up and down with post-it notes marking where changes should be. Now, you know, that's not the best way it may be a good way to organize for some, but it's not a great way to visualize for the organization. You know, they're just going to go 300 pieces of paper on the floor, 25,000 post-it notes. My eyes are glazed over and I've lost interest.
Yes.
Whereas if you've got the appropriate tools and you do it in the right way, you can very quickly consolidate that down into one high-level visual. Problem, so potential solution, impacts, opportunities, and risk. Really simple.
Yes.
And that logic can apply to every level of process, regardless of whether it's a procurement process or a sales order process or whatever.
That's great. And I love what you said there about starting small, you know, finding one key process or one thing where you can make a small tweak or a small improvement, because the executive team, they're going to be, that's what they're going to want to see. They're going to want to see, well, show me how this works or can this work? Because maybe they had done it a few years prior, but they bit off more than they can chew. And so by the time they finished that 6-month, 12-month, 18th month of documenting their processes, they look back and kind of ask the question, why did we do this again? What was the purpose of it? Because all they'd been doing is documenting, but to your point earlier, they weren't focused on the outcome, not the output, but the outcome.
Yeah, and it's all about leveraging what you've got. Like historically, people would say we're doing business process improvement. So they would do it as a one-off exercise. But things are changing so quickly now. The business environment is changing. And look, you know, our COVID experience has proven now that things are never going to be just one-offs. There has to be a continual adaptation to the business if it's going to survive and prosper.
Yes.
So we can't look at business process improvement, modeling, any of those activities as a one-off. It's got to be something that we start, it becomes a foundational element within the business, and that we use it moving forward. Because it's the way of being and doing within the organization. And if you're going to change that rapidly, then you need to know what the impact's going to be. You need to know what the return on investment's going to be. You need to know that Joe down in the warehouse is going to scream because you've now just put 6 extra forms in his in tray or on his iPad that he has to manage.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's just about leveraging things. So everybody's got visibility, that there's excellent communication around that change, and that it's all done in a way that the business can build on.
Yes, that's great. And speaking about return on investment, is there a particular example or a specific example that comes to mind where an organization has adopted BPM and whatever that looks like, or maybe they spent time, they focused on one process, they made some minor tweaks to that process. But do you have an example, I guess, under the banner of business process management, where an organization has put something into practice and it's delivered great value to their business?
Yeah. Well, I've got two examples. I'll give you an example of a small one and an example of a larger one.
Great.
We have a client who's in the IT sector, and they develop software. They do point of sale and accounting software for retail petroleum, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for the service station business.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been around for about 11 years, highly successful business, lots of sites around the world. And they got to the point where they were having issues with the quality of the software. So we used BPM with them to model out their development and software release processes, just
right.
2 processes.
Mm-hmm.
We worked out very quickly where the gaps were, where the weaknesses were, where problems were being created,
mm-hmm.
and then said, okay, how do we fix that? So on an average release prior to doing the BPM exercise, they, on every new release of the software, they probably get in the vicinity over a month of about 600 support calls, questions about how things were done, things that, let's just say, were unwanted functionality. And so they had a lot of issue. That was putting great pressure on their support desk.
Yes.
So we made a change. We introduced a hackathon process. We looked at the weaknesses. We said you could do it this way or this way. Make a choice which way you want to do it. They did that. We did the new release following that process. That release went out within 3 weeks, and their support calls dropped to 3 within the month for that new release. That's a huge gain for such a small process change.
Yes.
Then on the larger style, we did a project with a large civil construction business who said, we think we've got about a 10% overhead carrying factor in our business. We've got 10% of cost, that's too much. And if we're going to remain really competitive with our tendering processes, we need to find out what it is. But whatever cost reduction we come up with, or improvement processes, the process improvement we come up with, it can't reduce headcount. So we had some good boundaries as to what could and could be done. So we modeled out their end-to-end process using BPM, visualized it, got huge amounts of stakeholder engagement. How can we improve this? How do we do this better? You know, what's upstream for you? What's downstream for you? The buy-in was incredible, absolutely incredible. And at the end of that, they improved their process. They actually took a process which was at the very end of their normal operational process, which was defect management. And we brought that thinking right up front to say, how do we make this defect prevention?
Right.
So we did that. Great cultural change and mindset change for the business. But at the same time, they identified just under $1 million worth of cost that they could take out of their business and achieve that back on their bottom line in year 1.
Wow.
So if it's done properly, and you look at the process and you make sure those 7 elements are aligned to that process, you know, these things don't have to take a long time and have a huge cost.
Yes, right.
The IT company achieved theirs in a month. The civil construction achieved theirs in 3 months.
Yes, right.
So BPM is a great tool for shaping, thinking, and challenging.
Yes, that's amazing. And for an organization that, you gave us two examples there of tweaking a process or a bigger change, how does an organization determine when tweaking a process, they've tweaked an old process as much as they probably can, it's time for some radical innovation? I guess, over the last 10, 15 years, we've seen some huge industries disrupted by startup companies that, because they're coming in with fresh eyes, they're looking at it from a perspective of like, well, how can we just totally do something new that's going to be a totally, completely different way that this industry's never operated before? I guess it's much harder for a larger organization sometimes to sort of view, go about it with fresh eyes. But I guess big organizations do need to think about the future. How do we create the future? How do we innovate, not just tweak what we've already got? So, but how do organizations, or how should organizations go about that balance between the incremental versus the radical innovation?
I think the industry drives a lot of the big change because there's new ways of being and doing. So,
right,
to be competitive, the industry will drive the change. Great case in point is, automation for logistics companies.
Yes.
Artificial intelligence for health.
Right.
So there's software and technology will drive a certain level of change. It will enable things to be done in a different way. Mm-hmm. But there will be things that organizations need to do that they don't, they can't do anymore. Or they are doing that they can't do anymore because their customers just won't work in that way. Right.
And speaking about technology, what do you see in the future or over the next 2, 3, 5 years? Every organization is at a different maturity level when it comes to their process management, but what are you seeing over the next 2, 3, 5 years, and where do you think organizations need to spend their time, effort, and energy?
Well, I think they've got to spend their time, effort, and energy in getting those 7 elements right and working out which levers they need to pull, because every business will have a different problem to solve.
Yes.
There's no one way fits all.
Right.
So if they haven't got their strategy communicated and defined, and if everyone in that organization can't articulate what their role is and what they need to do, then the communication needs to be worked on. If their structures are getting in the way. So if somebody in a process has to go through 7 stages of approval and authority before you get an outcome, it's too slow. So drive that decision making as low to the decision point as you possibly can. And I think that's a big cultural change for most organizations.
Right.
Because they say, oh, that means that person that's talking to the customer on the phone is making a commitment for the organization as a whole. That's a big shift.
Right.
Instead of somebody saying, oh, I just need to talk to my manager or my supervisor and I'll come back to you. By then, the customer said, maybe not. I'm off somewhere else.
Right.
So they're the practical things that I think will drive some change. Processes need to be reviewed. It's not a set and forget. Every day, every person in the organization, their cognitive ability has changed based on experience. Let that experience be applied to the process. Every business is employing people and engaging people because of their capability. And then they lock them down and say, we've employed you to do this, don't do any more. I think we're seeing now organizations need to make that monumental shift to say, what capability do we have and how do we use it to maximum effect?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a really important point there. I think that there are organizations out there that in a way are suffocating their resources or their team by not giving them the opportunity, or not creating the environment for them to speak up and share ideas and share thoughts and share, this is what I'm seeing. I'm on the phone to the customer every day. I'm noticing this reoccurring problem. Or I'm in the warehouse, I'm in the factory every day, and I see I can identify a problem here. If there's not the environment to bring these ideas to the table, then it's going to be hard for that organization to develop the way they're doing things.
In the example that I mentioned before about the civil construction organization, one of the key benefits of using a platform to do the BPM approach and the improvement approach is that it allows people to comment and provide feedback on the models, on the diagrams, and have a general conversation about what's happening. Mm-hmm. Like we'd do one model, we'd workshop a model, we'd put it together, and then we'd put it out at the end of every day for comments. And people would come back and say, that might work on that site that way, but it doesn't work on this site that way, and for these reasons. So the level of engagement and brain power that you bring into that modeling process then is totally changed.
Yes,
because it's not one analyst, business analyst going out, or somebody who is responsible for doing the process improvement and the modeling, going out and having a conversation, coming back, typing it all in and drawing it up and going, I think that's how it works. Then going back and saying, is that right? No, it's not. Come back, change it again. Then we print it out and then we have a broader conversation. The platform takes all of that away. So we've now got new technologies and different ways of working that gets that feedback and engagement happening really, really quickly. And that now, I think, is going to be the future of BPM. Yes. And especially as robotic process automation comes in, machine learning comes in, artificial intelligence comes in, as technologies and enablers, if a business wants to use them, you've got to understand the impact of all of those things on the business. And let's talk to the people that are actually doing the job and say, how can we best augment what you do? How can you best augment what the business does?
Yes, right.
There's simple conversations and simple questions, and I'm just amazed that people just don't ask them on a regular basis.
Yes. And I think that it's important for the organization to have those conversations internally because, every organization are facing different challenges and problems and hurdles. And if they notice what another organization is using technology-wise and just implement that, without having those internal conversations and understanding, well, this technology might be valuable for us, but how are we going to put it into practice? Not just copy what someone else is doing and being like, well, they're getting value from it, so let's just automate these processes, or let's just have a bunch of robots doing these processes as well.
And that's so true. How many times have you heard of organizations that have said, I'm buying that system or application because they've got it. So if it works for them, it must work for us.
Right.
But their strategy is different. Their structures are different. Their processes are different. The information and data that they have is different.
Yeah.
And the technology they use is different.
Right.
How are they going to make that work?
Yes, that's right.
I keep coming back. From whether you're, just an administrative person who has been charged with doing the processes, or whether you're the CEO of the organization, ask yourselves what are the 7 things that we need to do in each of those areas, and what's the problem that we're trying to solve with it?
That's great.
And just running out to buy an application is not the answer.
Yes.
It might be part of the answer, but it's not the answer.
No. And there's plenty of cases where a tool has been put into use and without the other things in place, and then it doesn't deliver what they were expecting. And so they end up blaming the software or blaming the tool where it was because they weren't using it properly, or they didn't have other things in place.
Yeah. And then they end up not doing the improvement project that they set out to do. They end up doing a remediation. And that's completely different. One's a break it's broken and it needs to be fixed. And that takes an enormous amount of time, an enormous amount of cost and energy. And by then, everybody is so fed up and frustrated. When it comes time to start again, that's when we get the pushback. Tried that, didn't work, cost us too much time, cost us too much money.
Yes.
Whereas if everybody sets out, and this has been my experience with all the organizations that I've worked with, if we start with, we've got these 7 core elements in the business, what else is really important for this? And what tools and approach do we use to make this initiative that we're going to take highly effective for us? And part of that effectiveness is being really competitive in your space and being relevant to the customers that you want to serve.
Yes. That's great. And for someone listening right now that, they've been listening to our conversation, we've been going for 35 or so minutes now, and they're listening to us talk about business process management and what it can do for their organization. Maybe they're at a lower level maturity. It's a lower level maturity organization. They've never really took any sort of effort or time to understand and manage their business processes. Where should that person go to learn more about business process management and what it can do for their organization? Obviously, there is the internet, but sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming. And which resources do you listen to and glean from? And there's contradictions out there. So what would you encourage that person to do, or where would you advise they go to?
Well, obviously, your channel. Your Process Pioneers channel. I think you've just got some great interviews on that. I think that's a great starting point. Second, if most BPM vendors do run training sessions, albeit slanted to their own product, but you can pick up some really good ideas and ways of doing and being from those. Mm-hmm. I think there's a number of industry groups and business process special interest groups. You can join those. I think LinkedIn even has some business process stuff where you can go and connect with people. On a formal basis, I actually don't mind the APQC, which is the American Productivity and Quality Committee. Their site is quite good. It's quite informative. They have some reasonable material. So if you're starting out, that's probably not a bad place to go. But I think the best place to learn is in your own business.
Sure.
Even if you're using something like PowerPoint, Word, Visio, something small, if you don't have a business process modeling application, start small. Just list out a process and then note what systems does it use? What roles does it engage? What decisions get made? Just build out an understanding and then say, what's actually happening here and what problems do we see and how do we fix them? So I think starting with your own organization and starting conversations is the greatest learning platform for everyone. Yes,
that's great. I think, mistakes will happen, but that's where the biggest lessons will be learned.
Hey, exactly. There's the great saying at the moment, which sort of jars with me a little bit, which is fail fast, because I think if you're doing something and it's wrong, then you trash it. That's great as long as it's not, an Airbus up in the sky. You certainly don't want that to fail fast. So all of that is specific to industry. Yeah. But look, you will make mistakes, but that's all part of the fun.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's great. Well, Jackie, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me today. And even though in 35 minutes, we can only really scrape the surface on what there is to know about business process management, but I think that the audience will have gleaned a lot from our conversation, even if they just take away one thing that sparks a conversation, that sparks, that challenges their thinking, challenges their mindset. I think that's a win from this conversation. And for the guys that are listening, if you've listened to this conversation and you want to learn more and maybe you have a few questions for Jackie, then by all means, feel free to pop the questions into the comment section wherever you're listening or watching this. And I hope it's okay, Jackie, for them to reach out to you on LinkedIn.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. More than happy.
Great.
It's been a great session. Thank you. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Great questions.